Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Produce Safety Alliance Educators Call. It's been a little bit since we've hosted a call, but we have a lot of exciting updates, both in the realm of PSA updates and resources and FDA updates that we're going to talk a little bit later. So I'm very excited to see everybody who has joined. My name is Donna Clements. I'm the coordinator of the Produce Safety Alliance, and I am going to be starting us off this afternoon with our webinar. Today, we're going to be talking about labeled sanitizers for produce, a look at the new Webtool and other produce safety updates. And just a couple of instructions for us as we get started. Just a reminder, all participants are muted. There will be time for questions and discussion at the end of the meeting, but I always encourage people to ask questions as they have them. So feel free to ask questions in the chat box or add comments or resources in the chat box. Or if you raise your hand, I will be able to unmute you if you want to verbally ask any questions or comment on anything. As I mentioned, feel free to use the chat box, and the session is being recorded, and we will post the presentation on our PSA website after the call. Okay, so a couple of things that we're going to be talking about today. First off, I want to share some of our sanitizer tool updates with you. This is a resource that we've been working on for the past year or so. And I probably more importantly want to share with you some of the lessons that we've learned as we have updated this tool. We are going to have a little bit of time at the end of the webinar to talk about information related to revised subpart E, agricultural water. I'm going to turn it over to Betsy to give those updates. A few PSA staffing updates, as well as information on our next educators call. So I want to jump in here. We have a lot to talk about today, so I'm going to jump right in and give a little bit of background about sanitizers and why we're talking about sanitizers today. So just a refresher, when I say sanitizer, the definition is a substance that reduces or eliminates bacteria from surfaces and water. This is a definition that we have in the PSA glossary, and anybody who's taught a PSA grower training courses should be familiar with this concept of a sanitizer. It is part of a broader group of substances called an antimicrobial pesticide. I wanted to add that note because sanitizers, we're going to talk a little bit about EPA labeling, and that is the official term that sanitizers kind of fall within, is that group of antimicrobial pesticides. And when we talk specifically about produce safety, we really tend to focus on sanitizers used for a few different purposes. And we separate this into pre-harvest uses, so those that might be used for irrigation systems or irrigation water systems, and food contact surfaces, as well as post-harvest uses. And these are generally used for fruit and vegetable washing, also called process waters, and food contact surfaces. And I have a couple of illustrations here on the right-hand side. You can see the top right is an illustration of fruit and vegetable washing. Those are cucumbers that are being washed in a batch system, so just sort of a big Rubbermaid container. And we use sanitizers there in that system to help minimize cross-contamination between the different produce and that water that is being used to wash that produce. And then in the bottom right-hand corner, we have more of your food contact surface use. So in this illustration, it's showing a person washing, so cleaning, rinsing, and sanitizing harvest tools. And in that last section would be the sanitizer, again, used to sanitize the surface of that tool. And I'm focusing on these three different uses listed here because these are some of the uses that we really highlight in the new PSA sanitizer tool. And I wanted to show you this slide for anybody who's a PSA trainer in the group. You've probably seen this slide a few times before. And this is a slide in the post-harvest water section of the grower training course where we say, okay, it's important to carefully select the type of sanitizer that you use. And really the only guidance that we give here are a couple of suggestions on active ingredients. So we mentioned chlorine sanitizers are commonly used. And then there's also some non-chlorine options. And we specifically mentioned peroxyacetic acid, ozone, hydrogen peroxide. And then we also sort of mentioned that there are organic formulations available. And it was really when we started teaching the grower training course and having these conversations with growers that we realized the need for additional guidance was really a necessity. And that's where where the PSA sanitizer tool came about in way back in 2017 in its sort of original form. And that's really one of the big uses for the tool is helping highlight options that growers might have for sanitizers that fit their specific needs. And I also want to highlight here when we talk about the broad scope of selecting an appropriate sanitizer, the importance of selecting a sanitizer that is EPA labeled. And just a reminder that all pesticides, so remember sanitizers are under that category of antimicrobial pesticides. So all pesticides are regulated by the EPA through the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, or FIFRA. And this really is intended to ensure that a sanitizer or a pesticide will that using it correctly will limit the risk to humans and the environment. And one of the keys here is that they're really focused on limitations to harming the environment. That's one of the big aspects of EPA labeling. And it goes back to this requirement that pesticides, including sanitizers, must be registered. So they must be registered with the EPA and contain an EPA number. And we often get the question of why are we focused on EPA labeled sanitizers? So just a reminder that the produce safety rule does, and this is a quote from the produce safety rule, it requires that any method used to treat agricultural water, such as with physical treatment, EPA registered antimicrobial pesticide product, or other suitable method must be effective to make the water safe and of adequate sanitary quality for its intended use. And I want to highlight here that it gives those EPA registered sanitizers as an example of a product that might be used to effectively treat that agricultural water. The produce safety rule does not explicitly require that a product has to be EPA labeled. However, I wanted to show you this decision tree about the differences between FDA labeling and EPA labeling as a reason to support why we should really be recommending that growers use an EPA labeled sanitizer. So looking at this figure on the bottom of the screen, this is a regulatory authority decision tree. And this is actually one of those resources that I kind of keep in my back pocket when growers or other people reach out to me with questions about picking out sanitizers. To talk you through a portion, the relevant portion of this figure, it asks, is this product, so is this sanitizer going to be used in or on raw agricultural commodities or in water that contacts raw agricultural commodities? And then you move over, is the treatment in a food processing facility or during transportation to such a facility? So if the user answers yes, that product is going to be used in a food processing facility, that kind of bumps you over to the FDA side of things. So the font is a little bit small, but it says the antimicrobial substance is regulated as a food additive, and that's really the key word. That's where you get into a lot of those generally regarded as safe language because it's regulated by the FDA. And then it says it may also be subject to registration as a pesticide under FIFRA. So in my experience in talking to sanitizer manufacturers, it's not very common for sanitizers to be registered both by EPA and the FDA. It's sort of one or the other for marketing reasons. But then I want to point out if the person using this chart answers no, the sanitizer is not being used in a food processing facility, then it kind of bumps you over to the section that I highlighted in orange, where it says this antimicrobial substance is regulated as a pesticide chemical under FIFRA and is subject essentially to regulation by the EPA. So that's really the key that we're looking for, is those EPA registered sanitizers. And I do get questions, I wouldn't say frequently, but I do occasionally get questions from inspectors and growers who have had an inspection saying, hey, I had an inspection, a produce safety rule inspection done, and I have this product that is registered by FDA. Can I still use it? What's the deal? And in the end, we highly recommend that growers use EPA-labeled sanitizers. One, because inspectors are really trained to look for that EPA label. So one of the common questions they ask is, what is the product you're using? Can I see the bottle? And if that bottle doesn't have an EPA number, they start to ask more questions because they are really trained for that EPA label. The label is the law, and to look for that registration. The other reason that it's highly recommended is that instructions and efficacy data are really based on agricultural use scenarios. So we know that spent a lot of time talking about why processing facilities are very different. It's a very different environment that we're working within compared to farms. And a lot of that efficacy data done on farms and in that environment is going to be more accurate for that use. Okay, so that's I wanted to give that background because that is a pretty common question about why is our sanitizer tool really only focused on EPA labeled sanitizers, because it is sort of a subsect of all of those sanitizer products that are available. So I'm going to pause and see if there's any questions. And then if not, I'm going to go into sort of an introduction on some of the updates that we have made in that PSA sanitizer tool. So the first thing I wanted to share is where you can find it on the website. I'm showing right here, this is a screenshot of the general resources section. This is the resource or the section of the website where we really share grower-centric resources. And under sanitation, here's where you can find that URL. And if you click on it, there's a couple of options here. You can click to go directly to the Webtool, or you can click to go to the video tutorial and eventually be kind of pushed over to the Webtool. But I wanted to highlight a couple of updates that we've made to this tool. I mentioned earlier that we originally released this in 2017 as an Excel file. This came about when we started teaching the grower training course and talking to a lot of growers. They were still using, dollar store bottle bleach, and they started getting into issues with good agricultural practices audits or produce safety rule inspections, preparing for inspections, about what EPA labeled sanitizer product they could use. So it started off as a simple list and it sort of evolved from there. The Excel format had a lot of limitations on usability. So Rob within our team had the great idea of turning it into what I think is much more navigable web tool. And I do want to highlight that this was funded in part by the local food safety collaborative. So this would not have been able to exist without that funding. And a couple of updates that I wanted to share. Some of the big things that are different in this version is that we were able to add product labels when we could find those publicly available. I'm going to go into a little bit more about EPA master labels versus product labels a little bit later in the talk. But you can see in this green arrow on the right, that product name column, when we could find product labels publicly available, we hyperlink directly out. So it's pretty easy to access both the product labels and the EPA labels. We also hyperlink to the manufacturer and distributor contact information. A lot of the updates that we made in this tool are really encouraging users to directly contact the manufacturer or the supplier if they have those questions, right? We want to make sure that we use those as additional resources because there are limitations to using the EPA master label. And I'll get into that in a little bit later. We also added a search bar. This personally, I think, is my favorite function because I am a huge proponent of searching or Googling for things. So this way you can type in and you can look for, you can use that search bar to search for the product name, active ingredient, distributor, really any keyword that you can find within the within this. It's like a really nice control F, if you will. And then we've also added a compare function, and I've sort of likened this to if you're ever looking for like a new credit card and you can click out the different options and it pulls up and it kind of compares just those options. This is really nice because you can search for, you know, just PAA products, or say you're comparing a couple, like 2 or 3 specific products. It just simplifies the view a little bit based on what you're looking at. Okay, so there is a question in the chat box I think I'm gonna address. Oh, and I can't promise I have the answer, but let's talk it through. What happens in the case of countries that must comply with the standard because they export to the US, but there are no alternatives for disinfectants registered by the EPA? Is it acceptable for the disinfectant to be approved and registered by the country's authority? So that's a really great question, Catherine. Okay, so a couple of things there. First, I'm going to say I'm not FDA, so I can give you my thoughts, and if anybody else, any of the other panelists want to jump in, feel free to. But the first thing I want to comment is you mentioned disinfectants, and I want to highlight here, we're specifically talking about sanitizers. So sanitizers and disinfectants are have 2 different definitions. Sanitizers they decrease bacteria to a certain amount, whereas disinfectant is much more all in. So the definition of a disinfectant is really killing or destroying all microorganisms on a specific area. And one of the differences is that the contact time for disinfecting tends to be much longer. So more like a 10-minute contact time compared to like a 1-minute contact time for a sanitizer. So 2 different definitions. But I think the key of your question is what about countries that export, those growers, and there's no alternative to the EPA. So my understanding, so this tool really applies, it is relatively US centric. We have had this discussion about international, and my understanding is that an alternative, so the country's equivalent to EPA could apply. I know that a lot of these manufacturers have international labels, so I don't want to call out a specific product name, but certain products, if you look up that product, you will find a Chinese label or other labels. And I can use that because we looked up this specifically a couple of weeks ago. Does anybody else want to jump in from PSA about international?
I just wanted to point out that in the chat, the question does include if it is approved and registered by that country's authority that's equivalent to EPA. And I think you addressed it, but I just wanted to point out that was part of the question.
Thanks, Don. So yeah, so I think those are sort of our thoughts on it, but we have not received a hard and fast answer to really answer that question. And I'll ponder that, and I'll come back to that if anything else pops into my head.
Donna, there's another question in the Q&A box.
Oh, thank you. That is hidden for me, so give me a second. Okay. What about products like vinegar and hydrogen? I think it's hydrogen peroxide that are maybe hydrogen peroxide that are not regulated by the FDA or EPA because of its chemical makeup. Like you said, the PSR does not require EPA-labeled sanitizers, so growers can use vinegar. But how do you ensure that it's doing what they're intended to do? Okay, so the first part of the question was, what about other products? I think the key here, and I'm not going to go back, but earlier in the slides, I shared the requirement in the rule, at least for the water treatment portion. And part of the key is the grower has to ensure that it's being effective. And one of the benefits to using an EPA labeled product is those efficacy studies have been done, right? The manufacturer is responsible for having those studies, and all of that is incorporated in the label. And we will go through some examples of efficacy statements. So all of that is supported by data. If a grower is using another product, the onus really, or the responsibility would be on them to come up with that efficacy data and ensure that it's being effective. I will say vinegar. I did a little bit of a dive looking into vinegar maybe about a year or so ago. And there is some data out there on using vinegar on food contact surfaces, but it was very onerous to use. So it was a really, really high strength. I think that particular study had a temperature component, like they had to warm up or heat up the vinegar. So there was a lot of off-gassing, and it was a really long contact time. So there are studies showing that can be effective, but in terms of use, it was not very pleasant to use just because of off-gassing and all the other components of using it.
Can I jump in here too? During
Absolutely.
COVID, I did a deep dive on some issues with vinegar as well, because people wanted to use it for rinsing produce, and not good data on use in produce. Not a lot of data, first of all, in produce, but even where it's used in settings, like you said, it has to be a percent that is not usual to find. And the contact times are ridiculous. In ridiculous, I mean long. I don't mean they're ridiculous. I mean they're very long, and would be difficult for somebody to actually use as a strategy in a quick moving situation, like a farm environment.
To summarize, would you say that the biggest challenge with using vinegar and hydrogen peroxide is having the data to support that it's useful, effective, or that it is a regulatory hurdle?
I would say, as Donna mentioned, you have to come up with other information. And I would say, based on the time I've spent looking, you're going to have a hard time coming up with the information to prove it's effective in a situation that you can set up in a farm environment. Is that clear, Don, since you turned off your video? So I can't see.
Yeah, sorry about that. That was rude of me. Yeah,
That's all right.
that's perfectly clear. Thank you.
Okay. Sorry, Donna,
Great.
go ahead.
No, this is great questions. Thank you all for jumping in. Okay, so, and I wanted to do a pretty brief walkthrough of the tool. So just to kind of start off, the tool is divided into 3 sections. One of the nice things is it's viewable from one screen. The Excel sheet, you had to really poke around. There were different tabs. So this just makes it easier to sort of have all of the information right in one screen. As I mentioned, we added this product name section. So instead of really focusing on organizing based on the EPA master label name, we now added in this product name. So that's sort of really how the organization works. And then we have one column on the active ingredient. Oops. And then I did want to share that the content of the tool still centers around the EPA master label details. So even though we added in product label, they are not always publicly available. Product labels can also differ by state. For anybody in California who's used to looking at sanitizer labels, you might notice that there's often a very special California-centric product label. So one of the nice things about the EPA master label is it's a federal label, and it's always there. So it always has a hyperlink to click on. And we're going to go into a couple of different examples in a little bit. And then the label details are broken down really into 4 sections. So we reorganized it so we have a distinct pre-harvest section and a post-harvest section. I want to highlight that pre-harvest, we do have irrigation water systems. I think with some of the new Subpart E requirements, treating irrigation water is really going to be a big topic of discussion. So this kind of allows us to really, or the user to really focus down on the specific labeled use that they're looking for. So I think this is going to be helpful moving forward as we start really thinking more about water treatment. And then we have this whole post-harvest section with 3 different categories. So we have food contact surfaces, and then a new one we added was post-harvest water distribution systems, because that is a distinct category listed in several EPA labels. And then I also think that's going to be important with Subpart E coming, or with Subpart E. And agricultural water requirements. And then the last section is fruit and vegetable wash water. And then we have this third section. The last section is additional product information. We maintained this Organic Materials Review Institute, or OMRI column. This identifies whether the product is labeled for organic use. That was in the older version of the tool as well. Amount purchasable, this is based on the EPA label, again, because that's a federal label. And then lastly, we added in this manufacturer/distributor column. The column has always been available. However, what we did is we hyperlinked directly to that manufacturer contact us website when we could find it. And again, we're really trying to make the tool kind of a jumping off point for finding specific information for each product. So by including that manufacturer distributor contact information, maybe it's just going to save people a couple of Google search terms. But again, the intent is to making it so that if you have questions, you can directly contact that manufacturer. And I do want to highlight, because one of the questions that was submitted to in the registration was asking for recommendations for where growers can access various sanitizers, such as distributors. And this is actually something that came up in the focus group for the tool revisions, was really finding, like hey, where can I add this to my cart? How can I more easily find how to purchase this information? And unfortunately, we found that very difficult to condense that down into the tool. So our hope is by adding the contact us, the hyperlinks, that is kind of a way to help address that need. It's not a perfect solution, but we hope that it at least helps users find that information. Okay, so that was the really quick walkthrough of the basic tool components. I now want to share a little bit of information about some of the lessons that we learned about EPA labels, what we're really calling EPA master labels versus product labels. So first, I want to share a couple of definitions with you, because that's going to set the stage on what we're talking about in some of the examples that I show you moving forward. But when I say an EPA master label, this is that federal label. In the example here on the right, I pulled up the EPA, or the cover sheet for the AgChlor 310. So this is the cover sheet on the EPA master label, and that's 17 pages long. And what that master label does is it lists all approved uses for a given product. And some of these labels are, 60, 65 pages long. Some of them, like Clorox, some of the BioSafe ones like Sanidate 5, they're quite long, because that lists all uses that could be approved for that given product. And I want to compare that to the product label. So this now on the right-hand side is the product label for AgChlor 310, that same sanitizer product. And the idea here is that products might be sold under sub-labels or split labels. That's what we're calling product labels in the tool. And what these do is that these contain only a section of those labeled uses. So the directions for only a portion of the approved uses on the EPA master label. And this was really one of the big, I think I would say, improvements that we added in to the tool, because this was apparent when we did the focus group. There were questions asking about specific products, so the product label, and some of those labeled uses could not be found on the product label, but they were apparent on the EPA master label. So this is just trying to be more transparent on the legally approved uses on some of these different products. And I will walk you through an example in a couple of slides. So one of the things that we learned is we have always said the label is the law. So our earlier interpretation of that, the label is the law statement, is that the EPA master label is required, right? Because we say you should have an EPA labeled sanitizer. And then it's the EPA master label that lists those uses. So the label is the law, you have to have access to that EPA master label in order to meet this requirement of FIFRA. However, after doing a little bit of digging and speaking to different folks in the industry, we've realized that the product label could also or would also meet the label is the law requirement. And I want to read to you a little section of the EPA's Introduction to Pesticide Labels website. So this defines a label as the written, printed, or graphic matter on or attached to the pesticide or device or any of its containers or wrappers. So our new understanding is that this product label is a governing document and legally enforceable. So by adding in access to these product labels, it just makes the tool a little bit more transparent about some of these legally labeled uses for pesticides and sanitizers. Okay, so I'm gonna pause there and let people see if there's any questions and add them into the chat box. As I share with you sort of how we resolved this discussion, because this was a pretty big point of discussion amongst the focus group. So the impact that this has had on the PSA sanitizer tool was we added product labels to the Webtool, as I mentioned. And then the issue is the product label was not always publicly found. So the other issue or the other concern is that product labels do differ by state. So there's a little bit of not being standard there. Whereas the EPA master label is a standardized label on a federal scope, right? So it covers the entire United States. So the decision was made that we still focus the content of the PSA tool on the EPA master label. However, when we could find the product label, we compared both of those. So we pulled up the EPA label, the master label, and the product label, and we compared those labeled uses. And then if they were different, we added a note to the note column for that product. So if a product label was available, we compared those two, and we added a statement to the note section if the labeled uses did not match. So this is really where we're trying to focus in and say, okay, for this specific product, the allowed uses on the product label was different than the master label. That means you should find the product label, or if you can't find it, contact the manufacturer and ask them for a copy of that label. So you can really figure out what that product is allowed to be used for. Okay, so I shared with you a little bit of the sort of the nuts and bolts of what we've learned in this process. But before I go into more of the lessons learned, I wanted to do a pretty quick walkthrough because I think going through a label is going to make this make a little bit more sense than what I just shared with you. So I decided to pull up Biocide HS 15%. And what we're going to do here is I'm going to highlight how to access the EPA master label using the tool. We're going to kind of briefly review some of the labeled uses and efficacy statements on that EPA master label. And then we're going to pull up the product label for Biocide HS 15% and then talk through how that product label might differ from the EPA master label, and really sort of as educators, what you can do with that information. Okay, so I had it just for ease. I have a series of screenshots that I'm going to share with you, but the first thing that I do is I pulled up the PSA sanitizer tool, and I wanted to focus, as I said, on biocide HS 15%. So a couple of columns that I want to talk you through here. The first one is this name on the EPA master label. So there's a hyperlink there. We're going to click on that link to access the EPA master label in its entirety. And then you can see here that biocide HS 15% on the master label is labeled for treating irrigation water systems. It's labeled for treating non-porous food contact surfaces, post-harvest water distribution systems, and fruit and vegetable wash water. So this product is really labeled for all of these uses. And then I want to highlight this last column under efficacy statement. So biocide HS 15% is labeled to control human pathogens for food contact surfaces. So that's the only use, even though it's labeled for treating all of these things, it's only labeled to control human pathogens specifically for food contact surfaces. And I'll show you what that looks like in a slide. So what we're going to do is I click open that hyperlink. It's going to pull open the EPA website. I click on the most recent date. So this was just the EPA master label was just revised in 2020. So I click on that, and it takes me to the EPA master label. So it's 17 pages long. And I know from the tool that if I want to be taken to washing fruits and vegetables, that fruit and vegetable process water system, that's going to be on page, I believe it's page 9. So what I can do is instead of scrolling, I just hit where that orange arrow is. I'll put a 9 in there, and it takes me directly to that page. And I want to highlight what specifically the labeled use is for treatment of fruit and vegetable process water systems. So what this statement says is this product can be used in water or ice that contacts raw or fresh, post-harvest or further processed fruits and vegetables for the control of spoilage and decay causing bacteria and fungi. So really for that washing fruits and vegetables label statement, this product is labeled so there's data to show that it is successful in controlling spoilage and decay causing bacteria and fungi. And I want to compare that statement to the sanitizing statement. So the sanitization statement on page 5 of this EPA label. So this says that it's used for pre-cleaned surfaces, and then it lists out equipment, pipelines, it lists out a number of examples. And then the actual efficacy statement says, this product has demonstrated a greater than 99.999% reduction of Staphylococcus aureus and E. coli. So the big difference between the efficacy statements for fruit and vegetable wash water and food contact surfaces is that for food contact surfaces, it controls public health organisms. So my take home is that biocide HS 15% is not currently labeled to control public health organisms in fruit and vegetable wash water. So you can use it, but there isn't the data to support in the label. There is not the data to support that it is effective at controlling human pathogens or public health organisms. So really what this means is that some audits and regulations may not consider it to be an appropriate treatment to maintain the quality of post-harvest wash water. And we are starting to see this more, that specific audits and regulations are looking for that efficacy statement for controlling or for wash water. Okay. So I just wanted to talk you through one other portion of the EPA label for going back to the treatment of fruit and vegetable process water systems. I want to highlight, I'm not going to read it to you, but I want to highlight that this label actually has quite a bit of information on how this product can be used. Some of the examples include dilution instructions. So how a grower can meet that or make that appropriate dilution between 30 to 300 parts per million peroxyacetic acid. It has a recommendation for contact time. So 60 seconds is recommended to ensure efficacy. And then it also has some suggestions on how it is allowed to be used. So it can be continuously sprayed or submerged. And it also says that a potable rinse is not required. So that's sort of a quick talk through of how the EPA master label can be interpreted. To wrap up this example, I want to show you what the product label looks like for Biocide HS 15%. And again, we're looking at the PSA sanitizer tool here. And I want to point you to this second orange arrow. So the column that says labeled for use in irrigation water systems. So the EPA master label for Biocide HS 15% says that it is labeled for irrigation water systems on page 15. But what I want to do is I want to pull open that product name and show you this product label. So again, I have two boxes here that show you sanitization and treatment of fruit and vegetable processed water systems. That language is identical to what we saw in the EPA master label. But what I want to show you here is that if I look for irrigation, so if I do just a quick Control F to find irrigation, that labeled use is not included in the product label. So it is included in the EPA master label, which lists all those approved uses, but not specifically for the Biocide HS 15% product label. So what this means is that Biocide HS 15%, this product is not approved for use in irrigation water systems. And if we revisit that PSA sanitizer tool, we saw this when we did our review of the labels, and it has a note here highlighting the allowed uses for the product label differ from uses on the EPA master label. So as a PSA trainer, I want to highlight that that is your indication, or for anybody using this tool, that is your indication that you really want to access and look up that product label to use to make sure that the uses are allowed for that product. Okay, so a couple of additional observations that we learned in updating this tool. We did notice that there tend to be fewer sodium hypochlorite products labeled for fruit and vegetable wash water. So Clorox products used to be a very accessible option. That was always my go-to when I was working with smaller growers, saying, you can just go to Home Depot or Walmart and find a product. We're generally seeing that there are fewer and fewer of those Clorox and other sodium hypochlorite products labeled for that use. So I just wanted to that's just an observation. We are tending to see more, I would say, agricultural tended products. So we're seeing more sanitizers labeled to control public health organisms in fruit and vegetable wash water. I don't want to name specific names, but you can do a search in the tool and find that compared to before, when there was like, your Sanidate, I think it's Sanidate 15. There's a few of them, but now we're seeing more and more, especially as labels are updated. And currently, there are no sanitizer products labeled to treat irrigation water for public health organisms, although we know that there is at least one product in the pipeline. So I am going to quickly review a few of my favorite resources, and then I'm going to turn this over to Betsy to talk a little bit about Subpart E. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly review these. Toria is dropping links in the chat box, and we are also going to hyperlink these resources on the PDF version of the slides on the website if you want to go back and access these at a later point. So I do have a basic video tutorial up on YouTube, kind of talking through similar to what we talked through today. And we are also developing a second short tutorial going through a label example. We do have an EPA labeled sanitizer fact sheet. This is from 2018. I do anticipate reviewing and revising it a little bit to update it. And then I just wanted to share a few of my favorite resources on actually using sanitizers, right? So today we talked through some resources and lessons learned about selecting a sanitizer. Here are some of my favorites about actually using them. So these are two resources out of University of Vermont, Chris Callahan's program. One is a sanitizer dose calculator for anybody who is not great at math on the fly. And then the other is a safely dispensing sanitizers fact sheet, especially when, particularly for when growers have to buy bigger portions of sanitizers and they want to kind of offload them into and use more of a handle, an amount that is easier to handle and dispense. And then these next couple of resources are more about sanitizer chemistry and use. This first is a series out of University of Arizona. This is all about using pre-harvest agricultural irrigation. And there's 3 different fact sheets. One is all about hypochlorites, one is all about peroxyacetic acid. And then this is a post-harvest sanitizer use. This is one of my favorites for growers who are just sort of trying to understand the chemistry and use and recommendations for chlorine-based and peroxyacetic acid-based sanitizers post-harvest. And then in terms of acknowledgements, I wanted to thank Tommy for sort of developing the initial version of these slides, and really the entire PSA team for working on updates to the sanitizer tool. And then lastly, our focus group members, we had some very great discussion, and I learned a lot from that discussion. So a huge thank you to those people who took their time to give input on this resource. So I'm going to pause. And I will encourage anybody, if they have questions, you can raise your hand or ask in the chat box. We did have some good discussion earlier. And then I'm going to hand it over to Betsy. Yeah, I don't see any questions yet.
Yeah, I think we need to give them 30 seconds to get some questions in.
Yeah. Betsy, I think you're good to go, and we can revisit if anybody has questions, put them in the chat or the Q&A, and we can revisit sort of at the end.
Okay, so I will go rather quickly because I want to get out on time, and I also want to leave people an opportunity to ask questions because that's why we're here today. So this should be common knowledge to everybody on this call. That the revisions for the FSMA PSR Subpart E were published on May 6, 2024. We left a QR code for everybody to link into there. These come with new compliance dates and some FDA resources and changes to the PSA grower training course delivery, which we're going to talk about in this next slide sets as we go through. Next slide, Donna. As a reminder, right? The PSR covers sprout production, and then there's sections for pre-harvest water and post-harvest water, right? So this does not change sprouts, and it doesn't change really the practices for harvest and post-harvest. The important thing here is that the pre-harvest water compliance dates, you can see, will begin April 7th of 25. And then they will step in for the next business size, smaller business sizes as we move into the 4/6/26 and 4/5/27. Why is that not 4/7/26 and 4/7/27? And that has to do with the day of the week it falls on, right? So they move it to a business day. You'll notice for post-harvest water compliance, We added in parens here enforcement dates, and that's to remind you that there was enforcement discretion. So each of those compliance dates have an additional year for the enforcement dates. Okay, next slide. In terms of the overview of what we saw in the revisions, it lines up well with a few minor things to the 2021 proposed revisions. You're looking at post-harvest water, not from a test metric standpoint, but from a systems assessment, which is that agricultural water assessment. Some people are calling it the AGWA. And again, we're not looking at a single testing or an MWQP, which we had all taught for many years. So that is not the key component to this, right? The key component is this agricultural water assessment. Once you do that agricultural water assessment, you have to then look at an outcome. If you have no risks, there won't be any measures needed. If you identify certain categories of risks, you'll have to look at mitigation measures to reduce those risks or corrective measures to address the conditions that are causing the water to not be safe or of adequate sanitary quality. Again, those words should ring in everybody's ears as a qualitative standard, right? Must be safe and adequate sanitary quality for its intended use. Again, no changes for requirements for sprouts or ag water used at or after harvest. Okay, next slide. There are many resources at FDA. You can reach them here through the QR code. And we encourage everybody to take a look at them. Some of them are very informative. I do want to point out that the Ag Water Assessment Builder does have a V2. So there have been some changes made to that. And all of these other things are available at this link. So please take a look at those resources. Next slide. I want to bring up, we've shared this a few times, but I do want to bring this again to your all's attention. The grower training course delivery. In the short term, you still deliver 5.1. I want to encourage everybody to be using those PSA supplemental slides, which were based on the 2021 proposed revisions. So as I mentioned earlier, they line up well with what we're seeing. So in the meantime, use those and tell the folks this is, where it's settled. We sent an email on May the 3rd. As a trainer, you should have received that. If you didn't, check your junk mail. What we are working on right now, and our stated goal is to get you revised module 5.1 slides. We hope to make those available very, very soon. We are going to ask trainers to use those revised module 5.1 slides instead of delivering the current 5.1. There will be an educator's call and a video tutorial of what that should sound like. We will get all that information to you. In fact, we're working on it right now. In the longer term, if there is funding, and that we do not know, we may be looking at a creation of 2.0. Why is that? Because pre-harvest water impacts a lot of other modules. So we are hopefully going to get funding to do 2.0. I can't say that for sure is going to happen. Next slide. What to expect from us. You can expect that we will get you revised module 5.1 slides. We will give you a webinar to talk about how those were developed. What are the key things? We will get you new 5.1 handouts. Again, we're working on this right now. We intend to create an extension slide set that people can deliver if you have growers in your area who are like, okay, I don't want to go through the PSA training again. Can't you just give me an update of what these changes are? We're working on something like that so people can use it at grower meetings, and of course a webinar to talk about those slides and their use. And then there are many PSA resources. We've got a list going that we're going to have to update with these new changes, and we're working on those at the same time. Next slide. I do want to go over some changes with the PSA team. First of all, Collins Bujingo is leaving us. He is moving to plant pathology extension at Oregon State starting in June. Anybody who's following the bouncing ball will know that Collins was our Northwest Extension Associate. When we lost Thais, he became the Western Regional Extension Associate. So now Davis is going to step up and fill that role as the new Western Regional Extension Associate. We're also losing Laura Pineda Bermudez, who you all may think, was she really with the PSA? And the answer is she was always part of the National GAPS program, but did a ton of work with the PSA. So many of you recognize her name and certainly recognize her face. I love she packs a powerful punch. I didn't write that, but it's totally true. And she is moving along to the Library of Congress starting June 3rd. So both Collins and Lauda, this is their last week with us, and that is a huge loss to the PSA team. So I want to thank them for all the work they did, and they will be missed. I do want to share that Lori George is out on some short-term medical leave until August 2024, and Don is going to be covering the Midwest Regional Extension Associate while she is out. So thanks, quick recovery to Lori, and thanks, Don, for covering that. Next slide. Just some quick funding updates. We're hoping to get an extension. We're hoping to get a new cooperative agreement. None of that is in place yet. And right now, neither of those funds is going to fund the team in its entirety. There's also a concern that I just mentioned with attrition that is happening with our team. We are getting smaller, and so the delivery is going to have to change in how we do things. If everything good happens this year to get us to 2025, which we're very hopeful at this point, very confident that that will happen, we're still in a difficult position for long-term funding. So here we are back in this cycle. Next one. With that, I want to let you know that we are trying to offload decision trees. I found a bunch in the warehouse. If you want them, these are paper versions. There is some things that, because of the changes we've seen, we do have an addendum sheet that goes with them if you want to use them with growers. They're great for growers who are new to produce safety, right? It's a great way to move them into it slowly so that it's not overwhelming. If you want them, let us know. Contact Toria at her email right there. We'll get boxes of them sent to you for the cost of a shipping label. Okay, Donna, were there any questions?
There is one, and Donna, you're on mute.
Thank you. And sorry, the Q&A, the new reboot of Zoom is hiding my Q&A. So I think Annalisa asked a question. Can I talk a little bit more about the example that you gave with the difference in labels between an EPA master list and a product label? Would the product label be the label that the grower should follow rather than the EPA master label? So the short answer is yes. So Don responded, what I do in this case, and I've been using this tool for about 3 or 4 months. So what I do, Annalisa, is I first pull up the tool, look up, so biocide HS 15%. And the first thing I actually do is look over to that note, and I look to see if there's a little note saying the product label differs from the EPA master label. If it does, then what I do is I pull up that product label, and then I go there. The nice thing, and I don't want to go back too many slides, but generally speaking, there are not a lot of differences in between the EPA master labels and the product labels that we reviewed. I would say less than 1/3 of them, I think, have that note. And I see Don turned off his camera, so he can disagree, but I usually use the tool, look for the product I'm looking for, and then consult that product label if I need to, if there's that note saying that the labeled uses differ. Does that answer?
Well, I just wanted to add one detail that I think simplifies things a little bit. And I believe this is true, correct me if this is wrong, the product label never contains information that's not also on the master label. So the master label is always the more broad label. So you don't have to worry that the product label will have things that you missed that's not on the master label, if that makes sense. I think that simplifies things a little bit.
Thank you, Don. That does.
Yes. Donna, Michelle Smith has her hand up.
Yep. And Michelle, I just unmuted you, so you should be able to speak.
Oh, super. And it's great to see your faces and voices. I'm not an expert on sanitizers, but as a general rule, when there are federal labels and regulations versus state rules and regulations, the federal rule preempts the state rule. So the state rule, unless there's some exemption from preemption, cannot be more lenient than the federal rule. However, states can impose additional requirements or be more stringent than the federal regulation. And biological soil amendments of animal origin are one example where EPA kind of sets the floor, and some states go a little bit further than EPA because that's what they've chosen to do. So another way to think of it is the EPA label is the rule unless the state label, the product label, is even more specific. Did that help?
It does. Thank
Yeah,
you.
that's great.
Yeah. Thanks, Michelle.
I noticed that Catherine Caceres has reposted a question in the Q&A, and I didn't know if she had a follow-up.
I was going to say, I think I answered it to the best of my ability. So this is similar to the discussion we had earlier about exporting countries who are exporting to the US and in-country authority equivalency to the EPA. I don't think I have anything else to add because this is not my area of expertise. This is somewhere I will say, I think every time we learn something about sanitizer labeling, I just want to throw in the towel and give up, but we have not yet. So this is one of those places that we are trying to find some more information. But I don't think I don't think I have anything to add about what we said earlier. Yeah.
I agree.
Excellent.
I want to go ahead and wrap us up because we're over by a few minutes. Just so you all know, we are planning to talk about the revisions to PSA Module 5.1 on June the 10th from 3 to 4:30. That will be the English educators call. We will then do the Spanish educators call on, it says Monday, June 13th, and that's not correct. It's Wednesday, June 13th. Sorry about that. And the registration links will be circulated, so look for that. That's when we're going to go over those slides and give you the link to the video. We are planning on doing a labeled sanitizers for produce in Spanish, and that will be given to you TBD. We're prioritizing the module 5.1, which is why that's TBD. So we'll get that to you as soon as we have a date on the calendar. With that, I do want a huge shout out to Donna for all the work to lead the sanitizer tool, and to the team. Her presentation today was great, and it will be recorded if you want to share it with anyone. With that, Don, I'm handing it back to you.
Yeah, thank you all. And I think the last thing I will say is my contact information is listed on the tool. If there are questions you have as you use it, suggestions, one of the lovely things about this is we can update it very easily compared to the old version. So we are pretty consistently updating it, especially because it's new. So please do reach out to me with any questions or suggestions. Thank you all. Have a nice afternoon.